I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of narcissism, trait Machiavellianism. And what I would like to talk about mostly is that these types of traits are not in a vacuum. They appear in a context, and I'm going to end on starting to show a little bit of what organizations might be able to do to curb the negative effects. So I'll start with a little bit about narcissism. I think we kind of recognize this do. So narcissism is an affective and cognitive preoccupation with oneself, and a very defensive way of being. People are very self-absorbed, that kind of thing. But we have to remember that it is a trait that varies naturally in the population, so that it is not something that we don't see a lot of. If you see this graph, some people have been studying this in college students and show that actually narcissism is on the rise. So I think it is a bit too easy to think that we can just select people out. I think that probably we also have to learn to understand what makes them tick and how we can perhaps influence people to not show such bad behavior. The truth is that they have some things that a lot of people find quite attractive. They have authority and confidence. They're very dominant and decisive. They're high on self-esteem. Those types of characteristics are things we look to in our leaders. So narcissists are often chosen for leadership roles. Especially when group members experience uncertainty, because they're very likely to look to the strong person then for leadership. However, in our work, we've also found that there are higher abusive supervision. So their followers tend to rate narcissistic leaders as more abusive, especially if these followers are low on self-esteem and core self-evaluation. So again, if they are feeling somewhat insecure. What we don't know yet is, are people low on self-esteem simply more attending to their leaders? So do they simply look at them more and therefore see more negative traits in them? Or are they indeed victimized more, because narcissists tend to like quite strong people in their background? We don't know that yet. So we know that narcissists often rise, but we also know that over time, most people start recognizing that it's a lot of bluff and a lot of self-promotion, and maybe not always backed up, and therefore they start to be less effective over time. So the negative side is that they're arrogant and ruthless, and that they're poor listeners and do not respond well to criticism. I think we can all recognize a couple of political leaders who seem to have that same problem. One study, which I think is particularly interesting, by my colleague Barbara Nevica, she showed that even when their team members rated their narcissistic leaders as effective, and this was in an experimental setting, in reality, these more narcissistic leaders had a detrimental impact on team performance because they reduced the good exchange of information between team members. So we should be on the lookout and try to counteract that. We also did a study where we asked, okay, so if you have a narcissistic leader, is there a way to survive and perhaps even thrive under them? Like I said, we know that narcissists are self-absorbed and that they endorse self-promotion. They really go a long way to show how strong they are, what they've accomplished, how important they are, and they like to impress. So they try to associate also with powerful others that they feel this makes them stronger. So we thought maybe self-promotion, which normally actually doesn't help you, maybe it does help you when you have a narcissistic leader. So we thought that narcissists might be open to cues that other people are more important, and that they actually might kind of like this kind of bragging behavior because they show this themselves as well. So this is what we studied. We had people rate how much they self-promoted, and then we had leaders rate their narcissism, whether they liked the follower and whether they perceived them as important, and finally how they evaluated their performance. I'm going through this quickly. If you want some more details about this study, please just drop me an email. So what we found is indeed that narcissists are positive about those who self-promote, whereas people low on narcissism are not. Those lines are not significant. So basically, we see they like them more and they attribute more importance to them. So basically, if you have a narcissistic boss, it might be good to brag a little bit. The worrying thing about this is, of course, is that narcissists who self-promote a lot seem to stimulate these types of narcissistic forms of behavior in others. So narcissism in that sense seems to sort of be contagious. And I think that's something to be aware of. I think we can probably all imagine these types of teams where the people are all bragging and bragging, but not actually all that much is being done. So it's a bit of a warning sign, that one, I think. So as I said at the start, I would also talk a little bit about Machiavellianism, which is a strategy of social behavior that includes manipulating others for personal gain. It's not necessarily wanting to hurt others, but not really caring much about that either. They're very self-centered, manipulating people, and they reduce the social capital of the collective because they're perfectly willing to cheat and lie and sort of have this the ends justify the means type of way of being. So we find in our work, we found things like that high Machiavellianism in both followers and leaders is associated with lower trust, higher stress, showing more counterproductive work behaviors, and that these relationships get stronger when two Machiavellians work together. So it's sort of a toxic combination that gives. We've also found that Machiavellianism is a very context-sensitive trait. For example, in one study, we see that that Machiavellians actually are very motivated by having autonomy. If they have a lot of autonomy, they have a lot of wiggle room, and they can really do as they please and see where to go. Well, they're not always bad apples, Machiavellians. They're very goal-driven and very egoistic. So if they think it benefits them, they can show very positive behavior as well. So in this one study, for example, we looked at, can they act as ethical leaders if organizations are really putting the pressure on? And indeed, they can. Although the followers did seem to recognize it a little bit, sort of the fake smile in customer service, when Machiavellians are showing this sort of inauthentic behavior for them. But it does, those two bits of information do start to give us some information about how could we use perhaps the environment to curb the negative effects. the idea of they're very goal-driven, and at the same time they're sensitive to constraining social environments. So we in the final study, I want to just highlight a second. We looked at whether organizational climate could perhaps exacerbate, enhance, or maybe also curb effects that these types of leaders have, or this type of trait has. So we're looking at situations that are either trait activating or maybe trait deactivating, in the sense of, in some situations, it's much more logical to show a certain type of behavior than in others. So some situations facilitate and others suppress Machiavellian trait expression. So we looked at a rules climate and instrumental climate here. So climates where you're supposed to follow the rules, or climates where that's less important, and climates in which anything goes, cutting corners is fine, versus climates where they have much higher ethical standards. And indeed, we find that Machiavellianism is only expressed in abusive supervision in either a high rules climate, or a high instrumental climate, or a low rules climate. Let me show you that as a graph. You can see that in the other combinations, the effect is non-significant, so you do not see any trait expression. But in the low rules and in the high instrumental climate, you see that Machiavellianism is translated into abusive supervision and then goes on to have negative effects on followers. So in that sense, I think I would like to leave you with a little bit of good news. The organization in that sense can stop the contagion of the barrel by bad apples. Especially Machiavellians are very sensitive to the context. So if we take good care and make sure that that rule breaking is not accepted, that bending the rules is not okay, that we follow procedures, that we treat each other with respect, and that is completely normal, then we can stop the negative aspects there. So with that, I would like to stop and thank you for your attention.